A black doctor saves a life mid-flight. Then faces the unthinkable. A black doctor was flying home after a grueling week at a medical conference, ready to finally reunite with his family. But what started as a quiet journey quickly spiraled into something far more shocking. When a fellow passenger had a medical emergency, the doctor's quick action saved the man's life, only to find himself questioned, humiliated, and accused of lying by a flight attendant who doubted his credentials. What happened next stunned everyone on board and ignited a series of events that would challenge deeply ingrained prejudices. Stay with me, because this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure to subscribe for more impactful narratives. It started as just an ordinary flight. Eleanor Braithwaite moved through Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport like an actress in the final act of a play she had rehearsed her entire life. The terminal, all glass and steel, buzzed with movement, but her path was straight, unobstructed. Every step was purposeful, the soft click of her Gucci loafers mingling with the dull murmur of announcements over the intercom. She clutched her carry-on with fingers manicured to perfection, her knuckles just tight enough to betray the subtle undercurrent of tension she wouldn't dare name. It wasn't that Eleanor felt out of place, it was quite the opposite. Airports, first-class lounges, and business suites were her domain. The spaces where she felt most alive, most in control. Yet today, something about the world seemed misaligned. She had noticed at first when the young barista at the airport cafe handed her the wrong drink. Her order was simple, an oat milk latte, extra hot, and yet the woman, with her loud laughter and brightly dyed hair, had made it lukewarm, barely sweetened. Eleanor had smiled tightly, unwilling to cause a scene. But inside, she had simmered. How hard could it be to follow instructions? Later, as she approached the TSA line, she felt the first real prickle of unease. The uniformed agent, a black man with a practiced, impassive expression, had looked at her passport just a moment too long, his dark eyes flickering up to meet hers in a way she couldn't quite place. Was it suspicion? Judgment? A silent accusation she couldn't comprehend but felt nonetheless? The thought lingered, irritating her like a splinter lodged too deep to reach. By the time she reached the first-class lounge, Eleanor had convinced herself she was imagining things. She had a long flight ahead, and there was no use in letting her thoughts spiral. Settling into her usual corner seat, she smoothed the silk scarf draped across her shoulders and allowed herself a sip of chilled Chardonnay. This was her sanctuary, where the noise of the world couldn't touch her. But even here, cracks began to show. A young couple sat 2 seats over, speaking softly in Spanish. Eleanor couldn't understand their words, but she found herself bristling at their presence. They were dressed too casually. Faded jeans, sneakers, and their laughter felt too loud, too free. She caught herself staring, her gaze sharp enough that the woman glanced her way, her smile faltering. Eleanor turned her attention back to her phone, chastising herself. They have every right to be here, just as much as I do. And yet, the thought lingered like a shadow. The boarding announcement came sooner than she expected, and Eleanor rose with her usual poise, gathering her belongings with unhurried efficiency. She followed the line of first-class passengers onto the jet bridge, her mind already drifting to the work waiting for her in London. A presentation to finalize, emails to send, a board meeting to prepare for. She was focused, assured, until she reached her seat. Seat 2A was hers, as always, but there, in 2B, was a man she hadn't anticipated. He was black, his skin the color of dark mahogany. His clothes were neat but unremarkable. A navy sweater, pressed chinos, and he held a tablet, his attention fully absorbed in its glowing screen. He didn't look up as she approached, and didn't acknowledge her presence in any way. But Eleanor stopped short, her breath catching in her throat as if she had stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to see. It wasn't his race alone that unsettled her. At least, that's what she told herself. It was his lack of effort. His casual indifference to the unspoken rules of this space. First class was for those who performed their belongings, who dressed the part, who nodded politely at one another as if to say, yes, we are the same, you and I. This man, with his quiet self-possession, seemed uninterested in playing that role. Eleanor hesitated for just a moment, long enough for a flight attendant to step forward. "Is everything all right, Ms. Braithwaite?" the woman asked. Her tone crisp, professional. "Yes, of course," Eleanor replied quickly, her voice tight. She slid into her seat, her movements mechanical, and turned her body slightly away from the man in 2B. She couldn't pinpoint the source of her discomfort, but it clung to her like a film, impossible to shake. The plane filled around them, the cabin humming with the quiet rhythms of pre-flight preparation. Eleanor opened her laptop, determined to bury herself in work. But she found her focus slipping. She stole glances at the man beside her, her eyes darting to his hands. Broad, neatly manicured, and the understated watch on his wrist. He was reading something dense, filled with charts and diagrams that she couldn't decipher from her angle. She frowned, puzzled. There was something incongruous about him, something that didn't align with her assumptions. And yet, the discomfort remained. As the plane taxied to the runway, Eleanor leaned back in her seat, forcing herself to relax. She closed her eyes, willing the tension in her shoulders to dissolve. But beneath the hum of the engines, beneath the smooth exterior she had spent a lifetime perfecting, the questions lingered. Who is he? And why does his presence unsettle me so? The plane began its ascent, and Eleanor felt the familiar pressure in her chest as the ground fell away beneath them. She told herself it was the altitude, the physical sensation of being lifted into the sky. But deep down, she knew it was something else entirely, something she wasn't ready to name. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, its engines humming steadily as the cabin lights dimmed to a muted glow. Eleanor Braithwaite settled into her seat with all the outward composure of a seasoned traveler. The champagne flute in her hand was cool, the bubbles rising in delicate spirals. And yet her grip was just a touch too tight. She sipped carefully, as though the act of drinking might calm the unease that had followed her like a shadow since the moment she boarded. Beside her, the man in 2B remained engrossed in his tablet. His silence was unnerving, not because it was rude, far from it, but because it offered no entry point, no way to assess or categorize him. He wasn't loud, like the young couple in the lounge, nor was he deferential, as Eleanor might have expected. Instead, he existed in a quiet, self-contained confidence that she found both puzzling and irritating. She glanced out the window, the vast expanse of night stretching endlessly beyond the glass. But even the stars offered no reprieve from the questions gnawing at the edges of her mind. The flight attendant returned, a vision of polished efficiency, her smile fixed in place as she offered menus for dinner service. Eleanor accepted hers with a slight nod, barely glancing at it. When the attendant turned to the man, her demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight warmth in her tone, a familiarity that suggested she knew him. "Captain Cole, would you like the salmon or the fillet tonight?" Eleanor stiffened, her eyes flicking to the man beside her. "Captain? Salmon, please," he replied, his voice calm, measured. There was an authority in it, the kind that comes from years of responsibility and precision. The attendant moved on, leaving Eleanor to wrestle with this new piece of information. She had assumed, what, exactly? That he was some kind of intruder in this space? A man who had stumbled into first class by mistake or by some stroke of luck. But a captain? A man who had likely spent more hours in the air than she had in boardrooms. The realization stung, though she couldn't have said why. It wasn't as if she'd spoken her assumptions aloud. They had lived silently in her mind, unspoken and unchallenged. But now, faced with the reality of his position, those assumptions felt exposed, as if he could see through her polished exterior to the carefully hidden biases beneath. She glanced at him again, her curiosity now tinged with something sharper, something closer to shame. He was flipping through a weather manual now, its pages filled with dense charts and technical jargon she couldn't begin to decipher. The lines of his face, illuminated by the soft glow of his reading light, were steady, unreadable. Eleanor turned back to her champagne, sipping quickly, the bubbles burning slightly at the back of her throat. The turbulence began subtly, a gentle shudder that barely registered. Eleanor barely noticed it, absorbed as she was in the internal dissonance of her own thoughts. But then it came again. More pronounced this time. A sharp jolt that rattled the glass in her hand. She placed it carefully on the tray, her fingers tightening on the armrests. The plane dipped slightly, the cabin lights flickering, and Eleanor's breath quickened. Flying was never something she feared. But turbulence always brought a gnawing anxiety she couldn't quite control. "It's nothing to worry about," Captain Cole said suddenly, his voice breaking through the rising tension. Eleanor turned to him, startled. His eyes were calm, his gaze focused on the wing outside their window. "This plane is designed to handle far worse than this," he continued, his tone steady and reassuring. "The wings are built to flex. See that movement? It's intentional, absorbs the stress." His voice, authoritative yet gentle, cut through her fear in a way she hadn't expected. For a moment, she felt a flicker of gratitude. Until she remembered herself, her position, her polished mask. "I'm aware," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. "I fly frequently." He nodded, unbothered by her defensiveness. Of course. The turbulence passed, leaving the cabin quiet once more. But Eleanor's pulse remained elevated, her emotions swirling like the unsettled air outside. When the dinner trays arrived, the man surprised her again. "Would you mind passing the salt?" he asked, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Eleanor blinked, startled by the ordinariness of the request. She hesitated, then handed him the small porcelain shaker. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite, neutral. She nodded, feeling suddenly self-conscious. The simple interaction felt charged, as though it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. She watched him out of the corner of her eye as he ate, each movement precise and deliberate. He didn't belong to her world. Not the way she understood it. But there was something in his manner that suggested he belonged to a world larger than hers. A world she couldn't see but could only feel pressing at the edges of her awareness. Later, as the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, Eleanor felt the weight of her own assumptions pressing down on her. She had spent her life priding herself on her progressiveness, her open-mindedness. She had donated to diversity initiatives, mentored young women of color in her firm, even attended corporate seminars on unconscious bias. And yet, here she was, seated beside a man who had done nothing but exist in her presence. And she had nearly demanded to be moved. The thought burned in her chest, as sharp and inescapable as the turbulence that had rattled the plane earlier. Captain Cole had returned to his tablet, his expression serene, as though unaware of the storm raging within her. But Eleanor knew better. He had felt it, too. She could sense it in the careful way he occupied his space. His movements deliberate but restrained, as if he had long ago mastered the art of making himself smaller in the presence of people like her. The realization hit her with the force of a sudden downdraft, leaving her breathless. She had spent her life navigating a world built for her comfort, never questioning the spaces she inhabited or the assumptions she carried with her. But now, at 35,000 feet, she was confronted with the quiet turbulence of her own biases. And for the first time, she couldn't look away. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the shift to an overnight flight. The hum of the engines had become a low, rhythmic drone, a lullaby for passengers settling into quiet conversations or slipping into sleep. But Eleanor Braithwaite sat upright in her first-class seat, her mind anything but restful. She stared at her laptop screen, the spreadsheet of quarterly projections blurring into meaningless rows of numbers. Her thoughts weren't on business. Not anymore. They circled the man in 2B, Emmanuel Cole, and the unspoken truths he represented. She could feel the quiet power of his presence, a weight that had nothing to do with physicality and everything to do with the disruption of her assumptions. Eleanor prided herself on her resilience, her ability to compartmentalize and press forward. But now, her carefully constructed composure felt fragile, like fine china teetering on the edge of a shelf. She stole another glance at him, her movements hesitant, almost involuntary. He was still absorbed in his tablet, the soft glow reflecting off his face. There was no malice in his demeanor, no challenge, and yet, his very existence in this space, beside her, felt like a confrontation. The first real test came when the flight attendant returned to collect dinner trays. She smiled warmly at Emmanuel, asking if he needed anything else. Her tone was unmistakably familiar, almost deferential, a stark contrast to the cool professionalism she had shown Eleanor earlier. Eleanor noticed the subtle shift, the way the attendant lingered just a moment longer by his seat. Her posture slightly relaxed. "Another glass of wine for you, Ms. Braithwaite?" the attendant asked, her voice polite but distant. "Yes, thank you," Eleanor replied, her tone clipped. She hated the edge in her voice, but she couldn't suppress it. The interaction left her unsettled, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Was it envy? Resentment? Or was it simply the nagging realization that she was no longer the unchallenged center of this space? When the attendant left, Emmanuel glanced her way for the first time that evening. His expression was unreadable, his eyes calm but probing. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," he began, his voice low and even. "But you seem uncomfortable." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. "I'm perfectly fine," she replied quickly. Too quickly, she straightened in her seat, a reflexive attempt to reassert control. He nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Good," he said, his tone carrying no trace of judgment. "Flying can be a strange experience. Being so close to strangers for so long. It brings out things we don't usually notice." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. His words were simple, but they felt weighted, as if they carried meanings she wasn't prepared to unpack. She turned back to her laptop, her fingers poised over the keyboard. But the spreadsheet remained untouched. The turbulence returned, this time more forceful. The plane shook, its movements jerky and unpredictable. And Eleanor's stomach lurched. She clutched the armrests, her knuckles white against the dark leather. Across the cabin, the clink of glasses and the rustle of shifting passengers created a low murmur of unease. Emmanuel spoke again, his voice cutting through the noise like a steady anchor. "The plane's designed for this," he said, repeating the reassurance he'd offered earlier. "It's nothing to worry about." This time, Eleanor found herself looking at him. Really looking. There was no panic in his expression, no trace of fear. He sat with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered far worse storms, both in the air and on the ground. "How can you be so calm?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. He smiled faintly, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name passing across his face. "I've spent most of my life navigating turbulence," he said simply. The second test was harder to ignore. After the turbulence subsided, a fellow passenger, an older man in a crisp business suit, approached their row. He leaned toward Emmanuel, his voice low but audible enough for Eleanor to catch his words. "Excuse me, but I believe I've seen you before," the man said, his tone curious but laced with something sharper. "You're a pilot, aren't you? Captain Cole, isn't it?" Emmanuel nodded, his demeanor gracious but reserved. "That's correct. I thought so," the man continued. "I flew with you once. Good to know they're letting everyone into first class these days, even when they're off duty." He laughed lightly, as though his words were harmless. But Eleanor felt the sting of them, the way they diminished Emmanuel's presence, reducing him to a novelty, an exception to a rule unspoken but deeply understood. Emmanuel didn't flinch. He offered a polite smile, his voice steady as he replied. "I suppose you could say I've earned my seat, sir." The man blinked, caught off guard by the quiet firmness of Emmanuel's response. He muttered something indistinct before retreating to his own seat. Eleanor felt the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge what had just happened, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she sat in silence, her champagne untouched, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. As the cabin lights dimmed for the night, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep. The rhythm of the plane, the hum of the engines, the faint rustle of blankets, felt almost hypnotic, but her thoughts refused to settle. She thought about the man in the business suit, about the flight attendant's warm familiarity, about her own reaction to Emmanuel when she first saw him in 2B. What was it, she wondered, that made her react the way she had? It wasn't malice, she was certain of that. But it was something, a discomfort, a reflex, a flicker of something she had spent her life pretending didn't exist. She turned to Emmanuel, who had closed his tablet and was now flipping through a small notebook. His pen moving swiftly across the page. "Captain Cole," she said softly, the words surprising even herself. He looked up, his expression patient, expectant. "I think I owe you an apology," she said, the weight of her own admission heavy in her chest. For assuming things I shouldn't have." For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze steady but unreadable. Then he nodded, a slight but deliberate gesture. "Acknowledging it is a start," he said. His words were kind, but they carried a quiet challenge. A call to do more than apologize. And as Eleanor sat back in her seat, the darkness of the cabin stretching around them, she realized that the real turbulence was just beginning. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The kind that comes not from peace but from exhaustion. Eleanor Braithwaite sat rigid in her seat, her polished exterior intact but her thoughts unraveling beneath the surface. The plane hummed with the soft rhythm of flight, the faint hiss of pressurized air, the shuffle of restless passengers, the occasional clink of glasses from the galley. But Eleanor's focus was no longer on the external. It had shifted inward, to a confrontation she could no longer avoid. Captain Emmanuel Cole sat beside her, his presence unyielding in its quiet strength. He was no longer the figure of her assumptions. Those had been stripped away, piece by piece, over the last few hours. Now, he was something else entirely, a mirror reflecting the cracks in her carefully constructed self-image. The third test came just as the cabin lights dimmed fully, plunging first class into a cocoon of faux intimacy. A young flight attendant, fresh-faced and eager, stopped by their row. She smiled brightly at Emmanuel, her voice warm and familiar. "Captain Cole," she said, leaning in slightly, "I didn't realize you were on this flight. It's an honor. I read about your work on turbulence prediction systems. Incredible stuff." Eleanor stiffened, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. Turbulence prediction systems? She glanced at Emmanuel, her curiosity warring with her discomfort. He offered the attendant a polite nod, his tone gracious. "Thank you," he replied. "It's a team effort. Really. The technology has the potential to make flights smoother for passengers and more efficient for airlines." The attendant beamed, clearly impressed. "Well, it's groundbreaking. You're an inspiration to a lot of us." She lingered a moment longer, as though reluctant to leave, before moving on to another row. Eleanor watched the exchange in silence, a knot tightening in her chest. The revelation of Emmanuel's expertise, his role as not just a pilot but an innovator, shattered yet another layer of her preconceptions. He wasn't merely competent, he was exceptional. And that fact unsettled her in ways she couldn't articulate. The turbulence returned with a vengeance. Sharp jolts that sent trays rattling and glasses tipping precariously. Eleanor's heart raced, her grip on the armrests tightening. Across the cabin, passengers murmured nervously, their voices a low hum of shared unease. Emmanuel turned to her, his voice steady even as the plane shuddered around them. "This is just a weather front," he said calmly. "We're passing through it. The pilots will adjust course if needed." His composure only magnified her own unease. "How can you be so calm?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He gave her a measured look, his gaze both patient and piercing. "Because I've learned to trust the systems," he said, "and the people operating them." Eleanor felt the weight of his words, the unspoken parallels between trust in machines and trust in humanity. She opened her mouth to respond, but the plane dipped sharply, cutting her off. A gasp escaped her lips, unbidden, and she closed her eyes tightly against the rising tide of fear. "Breathe," Emmanuel said gently. "The wings are doing their job. So are the pilots." His voice was a lifeline, grounding her in the midst of chaos. She focused on his words, letting them steady her. When the turbulence finally subsided, she opened her eyes to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. The fourth test was quieter but no less significant. It came in the form of a question, asked not by Emmanuel but by Eleanor herself. "Why did you become a pilot?" she asked, her voice hesitant, almost fragile. It was a genuine question, stripped of pretense, and it hung in the air between them like an unspoken challenge. Emmanuel regarded her for a moment before answering. Because I love the idea of flight. He said simply. And because someone once told me I couldn't. She frowned, unsure of what he meant. Who told you that? He leaned back in his seat. His expression distant. A guidance counselor. I was 14. And I just told her I wanted to be a pilot. She looked me in the eye and said, maybe you should think about something more realistic for someone like you. Eleanor's stomach clenched at the phrase. Someone like you. She had heard those words before. Spoken in different contexts. But always with the same underlying implication. A boundary drawn. A limitation imposed. What did you do? She asked. Her voice quieter now. I ignored her, he said with a faint smile. But it didn't stop there. I had instructors who doubted me. Airlines that suddenly had no openings when I showed up for interviews. Passengers who refused to board when they saw me in the cockpit. Eleanor's heart sank. She had spent her life navigating a world that opened its doors to her at every turn. Yet here was a man who had to fight for every inch of ground he occupied. And he did so with a grace that made her feel small in comparison. I'm sorry, she said softly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He looked at her, his gaze steady but not unkind. For what? For everything, she said, struggling to articulate the knot of guilt and shame tightening in her chest. For the way people treat you. For the way I treated you when I first boarded. His expression softened, but his voice remained firm. Acknowledging it as a start. He said, but it's not enough. The words stung. Not because they were harsh but because they were true. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight, and turned back to the window. Outside, the night stretched on, vast and unyielding, a reflection of the journey she realized she had only just begun. The plane had settled into a steady rhythm again, its turbulence now a distant memory. But inside Eleanor Braithwaite, the storm continued to churn. The dim cabin lights gave the space an air of quiet intimacy. Yet the divide between her and Captain Emmanuel Cole felt vast. Even as they sat inches apart, she could feel it in the silence. The weight of the unspoken truths between them. She turned her gaze back to him. He had resumed his reading. His expression calm but intent. The soft glow of his tablet illuminating the sharp lines of his face. For a moment, she thought about leaving him be. About letting the night pass in silence. But the questions pressing against her chest demanded release. Do you ever get tired of it? She asked suddenly. Her voice low but cutting through the quiet like a blade. He looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. Tired of what? She hesitated, searching for the right words. Of having to prove yourself. Over and over. Of being questioned, challenged, underestimated. Doesn't it wear you down? A faint smile touched his lips. But there was no humor in it. Of course it does, he said, but that's the cost of belonging. Isn't it? You pay it every day. In ways big and small. Just to stay in the room. And even then, it's never really yours. Eleanor felt the truth of his words like a blow to the chest. She thought about her own life. About the rooms she had entered with ease. The opportunities handed to her without question. The cost he spoke of was one she had never paid. One she had never even noticed. But that's not fair, she said, the words escaping her before she could think better of them. Emmanuel's smile grew faintly sharper, though his tone remained measured. Fairness has nothing to do with it, he said. Fairness is a luxury people like me can't afford to believe in. The next test came in the form of a passenger seated across the aisle. He was older, perhaps in his 70s, with the air of someone who had spent his life commanding respect. He had been quiet for most of the flight, absorbed in a thick hardcover book. But now, as if sensing the shift in the air, he leaned toward Emmanuel. Excuse me, the man said, his voice polite but firm. I couldn't help overhearing earlier. Are you a pilot? Emmanuel turned to him, his expression neutral. I am. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, though he kept his tone conversational. Interesting. You don't see many pilots like you. Not at the senior level. Anyway, Eleanor's stomach clenched at the words. She wanted to interject, to deflect, but she found herself frozen. Her breath caught in her throat. Emmanuel didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze evenly. His voice calm as he replied. That's true, But it's changing. Slowly. The man nodded, as though granting permission for the change to occur. Well, good for you, he said, the faintest hint of condescension in his tone. Must have taken a lot of effort to get where you are. It did, Emmanuel said simply. His voice carried no defensiveness. No need to explain or justify. But the weight of his words lingered in the air, unspoken truths hanging between them. The man nodded again, then turned back to his book, seemingly satisfied. But Eleanor felt the tension like a physical presence, a knot in her chest that refused to loosen. As the cabin lights dimmed further, signaling the approach of midnight, Eleanor leaned back in her seat, her thoughts racing. She had spent the last few hours unlearning parts of herself, dismantling the quiet, comfortable lies she had told herself about fairness and merit. But with each layer she stripped away, she found more questions, more doubts. How do you do it? She asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence between them. Emmanuel looked at her, his expression patient. Do what? Stay so composed, she said. When people treat you like that man just did. Like you don't belong. For a moment, he didn't answer. He set his tablet aside, folding his hands in his lap as he considered her question. When he spoke, his voice was steady but tinged with something deeper. Something hard-won and unyielding. You learn to choose your battles, he said. Not every comment deserves a response. Not every slight needs to be addressed. But there are moments when you have to stand your ground. Not because it'll change someone's mind, but because it reminds you of who you are. He paused, his gaze shifting to the darkened window beside him. And you learn to carry the weight of it. Because if you let it crush you, then they've won. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tightening against the rising tide of emotion. She thought about her own life. About the times she had felt the weight of expectation or judgment. But those moments paled in comparison to the constant, unrelenting pressure Emmanuel described. And yet, he bore it with a grace that humbled her. The final test of the night came not from the outside world but from within. As the plane soared over the Atlantic, its passengers drifting into sleep, Eleanor found herself speaking words she hadn't planned, hadn't rehearsed. I've spent my whole life thinking I was one of the good ones, she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. I donate to charities. I mentor women of color in my company. I go to diversity workshops. But tonight, she trailed off, struggling to find the words. Emmanuel waited, his silence inviting her to continue. Tonight, I realized how much of it was surface, she said finally. How much of it was about making myself feel better, not about actually understanding or changing. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of forgiveness, of absolution. But he offered neither. Instead, he gave her the truth. Understanding is the first step, he said, but change takes more than understanding. It takes action. It is uncomfortable, and it takes time. Eleanor nodded, the weight of his words settling over her like a mantle. For the first time in her life, she felt the cost of belonging. Not in the world she had always inhabited, but in the one she had glimpsed tonight. The one Emmanuel carried with him every day. And as the plane flew onward into the night, she knew there was no going back. The cabin was dark now, save for the soft glow of reading lights and the occasional flicker of a screen. Most of the passengers had surrendered to sleep, their heads tilted against pillows, their breathing rhythmic in the stillness. But Eleanor Braithwaite couldn't sleep. She sat upright in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her mind churning with thoughts she had spent decades avoiding. Beside her, Captain Emmanuel Cole remained a steady presence, a man who seemed to occupy space with a quiet self-assurance that both fascinated and unsettled her. He was awake, too, though he had leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze distant, his body at ease in a way hers was not. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, humming with the weight of all that had been said, and all that remained unsaid. It felt to Eleanor as though the night itself had conspired to strip them of their pretenses, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth. The first challenge of this silence came when Eleanor's thoughts turned inward, to the carefully curated world she had built for herself. She thought about the boardrooms where she had commanded respect, the cocktail parties where she had been the center of attention, The privilege she had taken for granted without ever naming it as such. And then she thought about Emmanuel's words. About the cost of belonging. And how little she had ever paid. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly, her voice breaking the stillness. Emmanuel turned his head toward her. His expression calm. Expectant. "Of course. How do you stay hopeful?" she asked, struggling to articulate the question that had been gnawing at her. In the face of everything. The constant challenges. The barriers. The unfairness of it all. How do you not just give up? He considered her for a moment. His gaze steady but thoughtful. "I don't think it's about hope," he said finally. "At least, not in the way most people think of it. It's about endurance. It's about knowing that even if you don't see the change you're fighting for, someone else might. And that has to be enough." "But doesn't it feel exhausting?" she pressed. "To carry that weight all the time?" His lips quivered in a faint smile. "It is exhausting," he admitted, "but giving up isn't an option. Not for me. Not for the people who came before me. Or the ones who will come after." The second challenge came from a memory. One that surfaced unbidden. Sharp and vivid in its clarity. Eleanor thought about a meeting she had chaired 6 months ago, where a black colleague had presented a proposal for a new marketing strategy. She remembered how she had praised his work in front of the team. But later, behind closed doors, she had questioned whether he was ready to take on such a visible project. The words stung now, their implications clear in a way they hadn't been at the time. She had told herself she was being objective, that her concerns were about competence, not race. But tonight, as she sat beside Emmanuel, she could no longer deny the truth. She had doubted him because of the lens through which she had been conditioned to see the world. "I've made so many mistakes," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things I didn't even realize were wrong at the time." Emmanuel didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured, thoughtful. "The question isn't whether you've made mistakes," he said. "It's what you do once you recognize them." His words hung in the air. A challenge and an invitation all at once. The third challenge was external. An intrusion into the fragile cocoon of understanding that had begun to form between them. A passenger from business class, a middle-aged woman in an expensive-looking blazer, approached their row, her expression a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled suspicion. "Excuse me," the woman said, addressing Emmanuel directly. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you the pilot who landed that flight from Chicago during the storm last month?" Emmanuel nodded, his expression polite but guarded. "I am." The woman smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Impressive," she said. "I read about it in the news. But I have to say, I was surprised. You don't often hear about, well, you know." She trailed off, gesturing vaguely, as if the implication of her words were self-evident. Eleanor felt a flash of anger on Emmanuel's behalf. But he remained composed. "You don't often hear about black pilots," he finished for her, his tone even but firm. The woman flushed slightly, clearly caught off guard. "Well, yes. I mean, it's just unusual, isn't it?" "Unusual doesn't mean incapable," Emmanuel replied. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. A steeliness that left no room for further comment. The woman muttered something indistinct and retreated, her heels clicking against the carpeted aisle as she disappeared back into the business class cabin. Eleanor turned to Emmanuel, her chest tight with the weight of what she had just witnessed. "Does that happen often?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Often enough," he said simply. The final test came as the plane began its gradual descent, the faint glow of dawn breaking through the horizon. Eleanor watched the light spill across the sky, soft and golden, a stark contrast to the turbulence of the night before. She thought about the journey she had taken, not just across the Atlantic, but within herself. "I want to do better," she said, the words sudden and unplanned. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I want to figure it out." Emmanuel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That's a start," he said, "but wanting isn't enough. You have to act. You have to be willing to make mistakes, to be uncomfortable, to have hard conversations, and you have to be willing to listen, even when it's hard." "I will," she said, her voice firm. "I promise." He nodded, his gaze softening. Then maybe there's hope after all. As the plane touched down on the runway, Eleanor felt a strange sense of clarity, as though the night had stripped her of the illusions she had clung to for so long. The world outside the window was new, bathed in the light of morning, and for the first time in her life, she felt ready to face it. The plane taxied to the gate with a subdued rumble, its engines winding down as it approached stillness. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign marked the official end of the journey. But for Eleanor Braithwaite, the landing felt more like a beginning, a new chapter that she hadn't planned but could no longer ignore. The light of dawn spilled into the cabin, pale and uncompromising, revealing the fine lines on passengers' faces and the remnants of a long night. Eleanor shifted in her seat, her thoughts as restless as the passengers who had begun gathering their belongings. Captain Emmanuel Cole sat beside her, calm and unhurried, as though he carried no urgency beyond the moment. His stillness was unnerving, a stark contrast to the mounting agitation Eleanor felt in her chest. She wasn't ready to leave this space. Not yet. The walls of the cabin had become an intimate theater for truths she had spent her life avoiding. And stepping into the terminal felt like stepping back into a world that might strip those truths away. The first challenge came at customs. The line for first-class passengers moved swiftly, but as Eleanor stood waiting, she watched Emmanuel approach a nearby agent. The man barely glanced at his documents before stepping out from behind the counter. His body language tense. Eleanor's stomach tightened as she watched the interaction unfold. "Is this your first time in London, sir?" the agent asked. His tone clipped. "No," Emmanuel replied evenly. "I've been here many times." "Business or leisure?" "Business." The agent's gaze lingered a beat too long, his expression hovering between skepticism and thinly veiled judgment. He glanced at Emmanuel's boarding pass, his brow furrowing slightly, then at the carry-on bag at his side. "What's in the bag?" he asked. Eleanor bristled, her instinct to intervene surging before she could think better of it. She stepped forward, her voice sharper than she intended. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" The agent blinked, startled by her intrusion. "Not at all, ma'am. Just routine." "Well, it doesn't look routine to me," she said, her tone firm. "This gentleman is a respected airline captain, and I'd suggest treating him accordingly." The agent's face flushed slightly, and he nodded curtly, waving Emmanuel through without another word. Emmanuel met Eleanor's gaze briefly as he passed. A flicker of gratitude tempered by something else. Something harder to name. She realized then that her intervention, though well-intentioned, had been yet another reminder of the imbalance they both knew too well. Her privilege wielded as a shield, his dignity left vulnerable in the face of scrutiny. The second challenge came in the form of silence. They walked side by side through the terminal, their footsteps echoing on the polished floors. But the easy rhythm of their earlier conversation had vanished. Eleanor wanted to speak, to apologize, to fill the space with words that might soften the weight of what had just happened. But she didn't know how to begin. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm sorry for stepping in back there," she said, her voice hesitant. "I just couldn't stand the way he was treating you." Emmanuel stopped, turning to face her. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a depth that made her feel unsteady. "I appreciate the intention," he said, his tone measured, "but stepping in like that, it doesn't change the system. It just reinforces the idea that someone like me needs someone like you to legitimize them." The words hit her like a blow. Sharp and unyielding, she opened her mouth to protest, to explain, but he held up a hand. "I don't say that to criticize you," he continued. "I say it because it's the truth. And if you want to help, you have to start by recognizing how deep that truth runs." Eleanor nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. "I understand," she said quietly, but even as she spoke, she knew the understanding was only partial. A first step on a path that stretched far beyond the walls of the terminal. The final challenge came as they reached the baggage claim area. A group of crew members from Emmanuel's airline had gathered near the carousel, their faces lighting up as they spotted him. A young black woman stepped forward, her expression a mix of admiration and pride. "Captain Cole," she exclaimed, her voice warm and enthusiastic. "I didn't know you were on this flight." Are you here for the safety conference? I am, he replied, his demeanor easy and familiar. It's good to see you. Nadia. The woman beamed. You're presenting, right? I can't wait to hear it. Everyone's been talking about the turbulence prediction system. You're a legend in the making. Eleanor watched the exchange from a few steps away. Her chest tightening. She felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in Emmanuel's accomplishments. Shame for the assumptions she had made about him. And a pang of envy for the respect he commanded so effortlessly among his peers. The world she had entered with him on the flight was one she had never seen before. And it was a world she now realized she had never truly understood. As the crew dispersed, Emmanuel turned back to her. Well, he said, his tone lighter now, this is where we part ways. Eleanor hesitated. The words she wanted to say tangled in her throat. Finally, she reached into her bag and pulled out her business card. If there's ever a way I can help, she said, holding it out to him. Please don't hesitate to let me know. He took the card, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, he said simply. And if you ever want to talk more about anything, you know where to find me. Their handshake was brief but firm. A gesture laden with mutual respect. As Emmanuel walked away, his figure disappearing into the bustling crowd, Eleanor stood rooted in place. The weight of the moment settling over her like a second skin. The morning light flooded the terminal, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Eleanor adjusted the strap of her bag and turned toward the exit. The world outside waiting for her. But she knew she was leaving the terminal as someone fundamentally changed. Carrying with her not just the memory of a conversation but the burden. And the promise of what had begun. The London morning stretched grey and wide before Eleanor Braithwaite. The air cool and damp against her skin as she exited the terminal. The city hummed with its usual rhythm. A sea of people moving purposefully. Taxis honking. Voices mingling in a cacophony of accents. But to Eleanor, the noise seemed distant, as though she were moving through a different reality. One shaped by the flight she had just taken and the truths she could no longer ignore. Her driver waited by the curb. His sign reading Ms. Braithwaite held steady against the shifting crowd. She moved toward him mechanically. Her polished heels clicking against the pavement. Her body performing the routine of arrival while her mind spiraled with the weight of her conversation with Captain Emmanuel Cole. The world outside the terminal felt unchanged. Efficient. Indifferent. But Eleanor knew she wasn't the same woman who had boarded that plane in Atlanta. The first test came at her hotel. The clerk at the desk greeted her with professional warmth. His smile practiced and polite. Eleanor handed over her identification. Her movements automatic. But something in her felt exposed. Raw. She thought of Emmanuel standing at the customs counter. Of the way his presence had been questioned. Scrutinized. She thought of how quickly she had stepped in to defend him. Not realizing in the moment that her act of protection had reinforced the very imbalance she sought to challenge. The clerk returned her passport with a flourish, directing her to the elevator with a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign. Eleanor nodded absently, murmuring her thanks, but the interaction left her unsettled. She wondered how many times she had moved through spaces like this. Unseen and unchallenged, while others carried the burden of being questioned, proving their right to exist in the same rooms. The second test came later. During her first meeting of the day, she sat in a sleek conference room, surrounded by her peers, executives from across industries, all dressed in the uniform of power, tailored suits, expensive watches, confident smiles. The air buzzed with talk of markets and projections. The conversation flowing easily, as though the weight of the world outside the glass walls didn't touch them. But Eleanor couldn't focus. She thought about Emmanuel's voice, steady and calm as he described the weight of navigating a world designed to exclude him. She thought about the pilot's crew member who had called him an inspiration. The pride in her voice, the light in her eyes. And she thought about her own team. The young black woman she had mentored last year, and how she had once questioned her readiness to lead a high-stakes project. As the meeting wore on, Eleanor found herself speaking less, listening more. When a colleague made a dismissive comment about the difficulty of recruiting diverse talent, she felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest. It's not about difficulty, she said. her voice sharp enough to cut through the room's polite hum. It's about who we choose to see. And who we choose to overlook. The room fell silent, eyes turning toward her in surprise. Eleanor held their gaze, her pulse steady, her words deliberate. If we want to talk about innovation and growth, we can't keep shutting out perspectives that challenge us. That's not progress. That's fear. The moment stretched, the silence heavy with tension. Then someone murmured agreement, and the conversation resumed, though the air felt different. Charged. Uncertain. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her chest tight but her resolve steady. She had spoken, and she had been heard. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. The final test came that evening. At a formal reception for the conference attendees. The room was opulent, filled with crystal chandeliers and soft jazz. The air scented with expensive cologne and hors d'oeuvres. Eleanor moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and shaking hands. But her mind was elsewhere. Across the room, she spotted Emmanuel Cole, standing in a small circle of attendees. He was speaking animatedly, his hands gesturing as he described something. And the group around him listened with rapt attention. The sight of him, confident, commanding, entirely in his element, stirred something in Eleanor that she couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps. Admiration. A quiet ache for the distance she knew still existed between their worlds. She didn't approach him. She didn't need to. Their conversation on the plane had already carved a space in her mind that couldn't be undone. A space where his voice lingered, urging her to confront the truths she had spent her life avoiding. As the evening wore on, Eleanor stepped outside for a breath of air. The city stretched before her, its lights glittering against the dark. She thought about her life. About the privileges she had taken for granted. About the barriers she had never had to scale. And she thought about Emmanuel. About the weight he carried and the grace with which he carried it. Her phone buzzed in her purse. A message from her assistant about the next day's schedule. She glanced at it briefly before slipping the phone back into her bag. For the first time in years, her work felt distant, secondary to the questions pressing against her heart. What would she do with this new understanding? How would she carry the weight of what she had learned? Eleanor didn't have the answers yet. But as she stood there, the cool London air brushing against her skin, she felt a quiet resolve take root. Change, she realized, wouldn't come easily or quickly. It would require action, discomfort, and a willingness to confront the parts of herself she had long ignored. But it will come. And when it did, it would be because she had finally chosen to see the world. Not as she wished it to be, but as it truly was.